Freedom stands as one of humanity's most cherished ideals, yet its very definition remains elusive, shifting like shadows cast by different philosophical lights. When we pose the question, is freedom doing what you want or wanting what you do? We confront a paradox that has troubled thinkers from ancient Athens to modern universities, from monastery cells to corporate boardrooms. This question cuts to the heart of human existence, challenging our assumptions about autonomy, desire, happiness, and the very nature of a life well lived. Before we delve deeper into this profound exploration, I invite you to join our community of thoughtful readers by subscribing to this channel. Together, we examine life's most compelling questions and discover insights that transform how we understand ourselves and our world. The conventional understanding of freedom presents itself with deceptive simplicity. Freedom, most would argue, means the ability to act according to one's desires without external constraint. This view saturates our culture, embedded in everything from advertising campaigns promising that the right purchase will liberate us, to political rhetoric championing individual liberty above all else. According to this perspective, a free person possesses the power to choose their path, to pursue their passions, to shape their destiny according to their will. The more options available, the more choices one can make, the freer one becomes. This conception of freedom emphasizes external conditions. The absence of coercion, the presence of opportunity, the removal of obstacles between desire and fulfillment. Yet this seemingly straightforward definition crumbles under closer examination. Consider the person who desires everything they see, whose wants multiply endlessly, who finds each satisfaction breeding new hungers. Such an individual may face no external constraints, may possess wealth and opportunity beyond measure, yet experiences a peculiar kind of bondage. They remain perpetually unfulfilled, always chasing the next desire, never arriving at contentment. The advertisement promises liberation through acquisition, but delivers only the perpetual anxiety of inadequacy. The political freedom to pursue any goal offers little solace to those who cannot determine which goals merit pursuit. External liberty, when paired with internal chaos, produces not freedom but a sophisticated form of captivity. History provides countless examples of individuals who possessed every external freedom yet lived in profound unfreedom. Ancient Roman emperors commanded vast empires, could indulge any whim, faced no authority capable of denying them. Yet many descended into paranoia, cruelty, and misery. Their unlimited power to do what they wanted brought not liberation but enslavement to their basest impulses. Conversely, history also offers examples of individuals who lived under severe external constraints yet embodied remarkable freedom. Viktor Frankl, confined in Nazi concentration camps, stripped of nearly every external liberty, discovered a freedom that no guard could touch. The freedom to choose his attitude, to find meaning in suffering, to preserve his humanity despite dehumanizing conditions. These observations point toward an alternative understanding of freedom, one that locates liberty not primarily in external circumstances but in the relationship between the self and its desires. From this perspective, freedom involves not merely the ability to satisfy wants, but the capacity to want wisely, to align one's desires with deeper values and authentic purposes. The free person does not simply chase every passing impulse, but cultivates the judgment to distinguish between desires that genuinely serve human flourishing and those that ultimately diminish it. Ancient philosophy grasped this insight with remarkable clarity. The Stoics, particularly, developed a sophisticated account of freedom centered on the governance of desire rather than the satisfaction of want. Epictetus, himself born into slavery, taught that true freedom belongs to those who recognize what lies within their control and what does not. We cannot control external events, the actions of others, our circumstances of birth, or even many outcomes of our efforts. We can control our judgments, our responses, our values, and our character. The person who invests their freedom in trying to control the uncontrollable becomes a slave to fortune. The person who focuses on what genuinely lies within their power achieves a freedom that external circumstances cannot touch. This Stoic conception does not advocate passive acceptance of injustice or withdrawal from worldly engagement. Rather, it suggests that genuine freedom requires distinguishing between appropriate and inappropriate objects of desire. We properly desire to act virtuously, to think clearly, to respond courageously. We err when we attach our happiness to things beyond our control. Wealth, reputation, the approval of others, even life itself. The paradox resolves itself. We become most free when we want what we can actually achieve through our choices, rather than making our peace dependent on variables we cannot control. Eastern philosophical traditions arrived at similar insights through different paths. Buddhist teaching identifies desire itself as the root of suffering, not because wanting is inherently wrong, but because most desires rest on illusions about what will bring lasting satisfaction. We desire things we imagine will make us happy, but the happiness proves fleeting, conditional, ultimately unsatisfying. This endless cycle of desire and disappointment constitutes a form of bondage. Liberation comes through understanding the true nature of desire, through cultivating wants that align with reality rather than fantasy, through eventually transcending the compulsion to grasp after changing phenomena. The Confucian tradition, while less focused on individual liberation, nevertheless recognized that true freedom involves the cultivation of right desire. The Junzi, the exemplary person, does not simply do whatever they want, but has so thoroughly cultivated their character that what they want naturally aligns with what is good. Through education, practice, and the development of virtue, the desires themselves transform. Freedom consists not in satisfying uncultivated impulses, but in reaching a state where one's wants have been refined through wisdom. Modern psychology has rediscovered these ancient insights through empirical research. Studies of human happiness reveal that increased options do not necessarily increase satisfaction. Beyond a certain threshold, additional choices generate anxiety, regret, and paralysis rather than enhanced well-being. The tyranny of choice affects those with maximum external freedom. They face so many options that making any decision becomes fraught with uncertainty and second-guessing. Meanwhile, research on self-determination theory suggests that genuine freedom involves not just choosing, but choosing in accordance with deeply held values and intrinsic motivations. People experience the greatest sense of autonomy not when pursuing desires imposed by social conditioning or transient impulses, but when acting from authentic values they have consciously embraced. The neuroscience of desire adds another dimension to this discussion. Our wants often arise not from conscious deliberation but from unconscious processes shaped by evolution, culture, and personal history. Marketing exploits these mechanisms, creating desires that serve corporate profits rather than human flourishing. Social media algorithms optimize for engagement, generating wants that keep us scrolling, comparing, consuming. Addiction represents an extreme case where desire completely overwhelms rational choice, but lesser versions of this dynamic pervade ordinary life. We want things because we have been engineered to want them, because our dopamine systems respond to stimuli in predictable ways, because our social instincts make us vulnerable to manufactured desires. Recognizing the constructed nature of many desires raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between freedom and wanting. If our wants themselves result from manipulation, conditioning, and biological programming, how free are we when we act on them? The person who thinks they freely choose to buy a product, not recognizing how advertising has shaped that choice, exercises only a shadow of genuine freedom. The individual who pursues goals imposed by social pressure, believing them to be authentic personal desires, remains unfree even while facing no external coercion. This analysis might seem to lead toward a pessimistic conclusion. If our desires are largely determined by forces beyond our control, perhaps freedom itself is illusory. Yet this interpretation mistakes determinism for fatalism. While we cannot escape the influences that shape our wants, we possess the capacity for reflective awareness. We can examine our desires, question their origins, evaluate whether they genuinely serve our well-being. This metacognitive ability, the capacity to think about our thinking, to want to have certain wants rather than others, opens a space for freedom within the causal chain. The examined life, which Socrates proclaimed as the only life worth living, becomes not just an intellectual exercise but the very condition of freedom. Through reflection, we can distinguish between desires that arise from our authentic values and those imposed by external forces. We can cultivate some wants while working to diminish others. We can align our daily choices with our deepest commitments. This process never achieves perfect autonomy. We remain embedded in causal networks that constrain and influence us, but it moves us toward greater freedom than unreflective pursuit of whatever desire happens to arise. Contemporary philosophers have explored how this kind of freedom relates to concepts of autonomy and authenticity. Harry Frankfurt's influential work on free will distinguishes between first-order desires, simple wants for things or experiences, and second-order desires, desires about what desires we want to have. A person addicted to cigarettes might have a first-order desire to smoke while simultaneously having a second-order desire not to want to smoke. Freedom, on this account, involves achieving harmony between different levels of desire, acting on wants we endorse upon reflection rather than impulses we wish we did not have. This framework helps explain why satisfying desires does not automatically generate freedom or happiness. The person who acts on every impulse might satisfy many first-order desires while violating their second-order commitments to become a certain kind of person. They do what they want at one level but fail to want what they do at a deeper level. Genuine freedom requires not just the ability to act on desires, but the capacity to shape which desires gain motivational force in our lives. The question is freedom doing what you want or wanting what you do? Thus reveals itself as a false dichotomy. Freedom involves neither simply doing what you want nor passively wanting whatever you do. Rather, it requires the ongoing work of cultivating wants that align with considered values, of developing the wisdom to distinguish between desires worth satisfying and those worth transforming, of creating harmony between different aspects of the self. This understanding preserves what is valuable in both conceptions. It acknowledges that external freedom matters, that the ability to act on one's choices constitutes an essential component of liberty, while simultaneously recognizing that internal freedom, the governance of desire itself, represents an equally crucial dimension. The practical implications of this insight extend into every domain of human life. In work, it suggests that freedom comes not from doing whatever job seems appealing at any moment, but from cultivating a sense of purpose that makes even challenging work meaningful. The person who has discovered work aligned with deep values experiences freedom even within significant constraints, while the person chasing every seemingly attractive opportunity remains perpetually dissatisfied, their freedom undermined by conflicting desires. In relationships, this understanding of freedom challenges both possessive attachment and detached autonomy. Genuine freedom in love involves neither clinging to another person to satisfy emotional needs nor maintaining such independence that real intimacy becomes impossible. Rather, it requires developing the capacity to want the other's flourishing for its own sake, to choose commitment not from neediness but from authentic care. The paradox of love is that we become most free when we choose to bind ourselves to another, when our desires become genuinely other-directed rather than merely self-serving. In the realm of personal development and self-improvement, this conception of freedom offers guidance that transcends simplistic appeals to willpower or positive thinking. The challenge lies not in forcing ourselves to do things we do not want to do, nor in pretending to want things we genuinely do not want. Rather, it involves the patient work of transformation, allowing our desires themselves to evolve through practice, reflection, and experience. The person who struggles with unhealthy habits need not simply override their desires through sheer determination, an approach that usually fails, but can gradually cultivate new desires through small changes, environmental adjustments, and the development of competing motivations. Educational philosophy has long grappled with the tension between freedom and formation. How do we educate young people in ways that respect their autonomy while recognizing that they have not yet developed the judgment to direct their own learning? The answer lies in understanding that true freedom requires cultivation. Children need guidance not to suppress their autonomy but to develop it. The good teacher does not simply let students pursue whatever interests them at any moment, nor does she impose learning through coercion. Rather, she works to awaken desires worth having, to show students why certain subjects merit their attention, to help them develop the capacity for sustained engagement with difficult material. Education in this sense aims at freedom, helping students develop desires aligned with their highest potential rather than their passing whims. Political philosophy must also reckon with this more nuanced understanding of freedom. Classical liberalism champions negative liberty, the absence of coercion by others, as the fundamental political value. This remains crucial. Societies that allow governments or majorities to control individual choices destroy an essential dimension of human freedom. Yet negative liberty alone proves insufficient. A society might maximize choice while systematically undermining the conditions that allow people to choose wisely. Advertising bombards citizens with manufactured desires. Economic insecurity forces choices driven by desperation rather than authentic values. Information ecosystems optimize for engagement rather than truth, shaping wants in ways that serve corporate interests rather than human flourishing. A politics truly committed to freedom must attend not only to removing external constraints but also to creating conditions that support autonomous desire formation. This does not mean government control over what people want, which would constitute the worst kind of tyranny, but rather policies that protect citizens from manipulation, ensure access to education that develops critical judgment, and create space for people to discover and pursue their authentic values. The line between supporting autonomous desire formation and paternalistically imposing values remains difficult to draw, but the difficulty does not eliminate the distinction. Economic life presents perhaps the most challenging arena for thinking about freedom and desire. Market capitalism promises to maximize freedom by allowing individuals to pursue their preferences without centralized direction. The market coordinates millions of individual choices, directing resources toward their most valued uses, generating prosperity through the cumulative effect of free decisions. This vision possesses real power. Markets have indeed created unprecedented wealth and opportunity. Yet markets also shape the very preferences they claim merely to satisfy. Advertising creates desires that serve profit rather than well-being. Competitive pressures force choices that individuals might not make in different circumstances. The person who works 80 hours per week to afford a lifestyle they never have time to enjoy exercise is a kind of freedom, but one that seems to mock rather than fulfill human potential. Some critics conclude that markets inherently undermine freedom, that genuine liberation requires collective control over economic life. Yet history suggests that attempts to replace market coordination with centralized planning typically destroy both economic prosperity and personal liberty. The alternative to unreflective market fundamentalism is not state control but rather creating space for people to develop desires that markets might not generate on their own. This might involve regulations limiting manipulative advertising, public spaces not organized around consumption, educational opportunities that develop capacities beyond economic productivity, social movements that cultivate alternative values, and economic arrangements that provide security sufficient for people to make choices not driven solely by financial necessity. The environmental crisis adds urgency to questions about freedom and desire. Modern consumer capitalism generates wants for products and lifestyles that cannot be sustained across the global population without ecological catastrophe. We face a choice between constraining consumption through coercive limits or cultivating desires aligned with planetary boundaries. Neither option is simple. Coercive limits threaten freedom and risk authoritarianism. Yet hoping that voluntary individual changes will suffice ignores the power of systemic forces shaping our wants. The path forward likely requires both regulations that constrain the most destructive choices while simultaneously working to transform the cultural narratives and economic incentives that generate unsustainable desires. Technology amplifies these challenges in novel ways. Smartphones, social media, and digital platforms have created unprecedented ability to satisfy immediate desires. Endless entertainment, instant communication, on-demand services. Yet this satisfaction of wants often undermines deeper freedoms. The person compulsively checking their phone satisfies a desire but loses the ability to sustain attention. The individual scrolling through social media feeds a want for connection while experiencing increasing loneliness. Digital technologies excel at triggering immediate desires while often subverting longer-term values and goals. The design of these technologies is not neutral. Engineers optimize for engagement, creating products that exploit psychological vulnerabilities to maximize usage. Variable reward schedules, infinite scroll, algorithmic curation, these features target our dopamine systems, generating desires that keep us using products even when we wish we would stop. The freedom to access technology becomes a kind of unfreedom when the technology itself shapes our wants in ways that serve corporate interests rather than human flourishing. Responding to this challenge requires both personal discipline and collective action. Individually, we can cultivate awareness of how technology affects our desires, develop practices that protect attention and agency, and choose tools that support rather than undermine our values. Collectively, we need regulations that constrain manipulative design, business models not dependent on addiction, and technologies developed with human well-being rather than just engagement as the primary goal. Spiritual and religious traditions have always recognized that freedom requires not just satisfying desires but transforming them. Meditation practices aim to create space between stimulus and response, allowing practitioners to observe desires without immediately acting on them. Prayer can redirect wants away from selfish concerns toward broader goods. Fasting and other ascetic practices train the capacity to resist impulses, demonstrating that we need not be slaves to every passing want. These practices do not seek to eliminate desire but to cultivate it, to develop wants aligned with ultimate rather than immediate goods. Modern secular society often dismisses such practices as repressive, seeing any constraint on desire as an assault on freedom. Yet this reaction mistakes liberation from tradition with liberation itself. When consumer capitalism replaces religious authority, when algorithmic optimization replaces spiritual discipline, we trade one form of desire shaping for another, and not obviously for the better. The wisdom traditions at least recognized that freedom requires work on the self, that our desires need cultivation rather than just expression. This does not mean returning to traditional religious authority or accepting all spiritual practices as valuable. Some forms of religious discipline genuinely were repressive, aimed at control rather than liberation. Yet the secular alternative of treating all desires as equally valid, of seeing freedom solely in terms of satisfying wants, proves equally limiting. A mature approach draws on wisdom about desire formation from multiple sources, secular and religious, ancient and modern, while remaining critical of attempts to control desire in service of power rather than human flourishing. The practice of freedom, then, involves ongoing attention to the quality of our desires. It requires asking not just, what do I want? But is this want worth having? Does acting on this desire move me toward or away from the person I aim to become? Does satisfying this want contribute to genuine well-being or merely provide temporary pleasure? These questions do not have simple answers. They require judgment developed through experience, reflection, and often error. Yet asking them regularly creates the possibility of greater freedom than simply doing whatever we want or passively wanting whatever we do. This approach to freedom emphasizes agency while acknowledging limits. We are not entirely free to choose our desires. They arise from biology, culture, personal history, and circumstances beyond our control, but neither are we simply determined by them. We possess some capacity to examine our wants, to cultivate some while working to diminish others, to align our desires with our considered values. This limited but real agency makes freedom possible without requiring the illusion of complete self-determination. Living freely in this sense requires courage. The courage to examine our desires honestly, to recognize when they arise from manipulation or conditioning rather than authentic values, to do the difficult work of transformation rather than simply satisfying every want or denying all of them. It requires wisdom, the judgment to distinguish between desires worth cultivating and those worth releasing, between constraints that genuinely limit freedom and those that create conditions for its exercise. It requires patience, the recognition that transforming desires is gradual work, that we will fail repeatedly, that freedom grows through practice rather than arriving fully formed. Perhaps most importantly, this understanding of freedom requires community. We cannot examine our desires in isolation. We need others to help us see our blind spots, to challenge our rationalizations, to model alternative possibilities. We cannot cultivate better wants purely through individual willpower. We need cultural narratives and social practices that support the desires we want to develop. We cannot protect ourselves from manipulation solely through personal vigilance. We need collective action to constrain forces that systematically shape wants in destructive directions. The question is freedom doing what you want or wanting what you do? Thus opens onto a vision of human flourishing that transcends the dichotomy. Freedom involves neither simply satisfying desires nor passively accepting them, but rather the active work of cultivating wants worthy of our humanity. It requires both the external liberty to act on our choices and the internal freedom to ensure those choices reflect our deepest values. It demands both individual development and social conditions that support rather than undermine autonomous desire formation. This conception of freedom is simultaneously more demanding and more hopeful than simpler alternatives. It is more demanding because it requires ongoing work rather than just the removal of external constraints or the satisfaction of existing wants. Achieving freedom becomes a lifelong project rather than a permanent state. Yet it is also more hopeful because it locates freedom in something within our power to develop. We cannot always control our circumstances, but we can work on our relationship to our desires. We cannot eliminate all influences that shape our wants, but we can cultivate the awareness to evaluate them critically. The path to freedom wins between two errors: the illusion that we can satisfy every desire without consequence and the delusion that we must deny all wants to achieve liberation. True freedom lies in the middle way, in the difficult work of distinguishing desires worth pursuing from those worth transforming, in aligning our daily choices with our deepest commitments, in creating lives where what we want and what we do achieve greater harmony. This freedom never becomes complete. We remain finite beings shaped by forces beyond our control, but it grows through practice, reflection, and community. In the end, the most profound freedom might be the freedom to become more free, to develop our capacity for wisdom, to cultivate desires aligned with human flourishing, to create conditions that support rather than undermine the autonomy of others. This freedom manifests not in the absence of all constraint but in constraints we have chosen, in desires we have cultivated, in values we have consciously embraced. It is the freedom to want what is worth wanting, to do what deserves doing, to become who we have the potential to be. This freedom constitutes not just a right to be protected but a capacity to be developed, not just a political ideal but a personal practice, not just an individual achievement but a collective aspiration. It is the freedom that makes us most fully human.